President, at 6 p.m. I've started the recording.
Good evening, everyone, and I apologize for my froggy voice. We're going to be led in the Pledge of Allegiance by Mr. Howard.
The flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. A moment of silence for the thought process of what's happening in the world today. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. Roll call, Mr. Clerk.
Ms. Burton? Dr. Henderson?
Here.
Mr. Howard?
Here.
Mr. Levenstein?
Here.
Ms. Maida?
Here.
Ms. Mineo?
Here.
Ms. Santiago?
Here.
Mr. Stridiron? Mr. Walker?
Be it resolved that the Board of Education hereby recesses into executive session for the following purpose. Matter made confidential in FERPA, employment history of particular individuals, matters leading to the employment of particular individuals, the review of programs and placements of students with disabilities, collective bargaining under the Taylor Law, NTA, and to obtain advice from legal counsel. I'd like to entertain a motion, please.
So moved.
Second.
Roll call.
Dr. Henderson?
Yes.
Mr. Howard? Mr. Howard?
Yes.
Mr. Levenstein?
Yes.
Ms. Maida?
Yes.
Ms. Mineo?
Yes.
Ms. Santiago?
Yes.
See you in a minute. We're going to go into exec. Mr. Clerk, let me advise me when we can start, please.
The recording's been started back up, Madam President. You're all set.
Thank you. I'm so sorry we were so late. We had a lot to discuss. I'm going to turn this over to our Superintendent of Schools, Dr. Padilla.
Thank you, Madam President. Good evening, everyone. I have two items for this evening, and I'm going to start with Operation Reopen updates. So I'm going to present my screen. Okay, so we have a couple of updates for this evening. These particular updates, there's 5 of them. We just want to communicate to the board and to the community what emergency days have transpired so far. I know we've had a number of calendar changes for a number of different reasons, but just to publicly note which emergency days have been used. Today, we did have to use another one, and we hear there's more snow coming this week. So this has been a winter unlike others that we've had in the past. I want to share with the board my intent for next week specifically. So next week we have our midwinter recess, and February 16th is an odd sort of day in that week right after President's Day, where we have an instructional day. So I do want to communicate tonight, and it will be followed up with faculty and staff tomorrow, that we will allow for Tuesday, February 16th only to be a remote asynchronous learning day. So again, just to be very clear, an asynchronous day is still an instructional day. It's still a work day. It's still a day teachers connect with students. Obviously, there's more flexibility on an asynchronous day. So we will allow for next Tuesday, February 16th, to be a asynchronous remote day. Just another update. I've been communicating over the last several board sessions that, we were charged as a school district with most of our schools, not all of them, but most of them being in the yellow zone, and what our requirements were. I just have to, again, thank everyone for their cooperation. And just a big thank you to every one of our faculty and staff who volunteered, and every family member who opted to allow their child to be tested. Just another big thank you on behalf of our board, on behalf of our district. Thank you for doing your part to keep our schools open. Uh-oh, what happened? Something just happened. Give me a second. I just was kicked off. That's never happened before. Okay, I'm not sure what happened, but we're gonna quickly resume. We do have a number of schools that have started to transition to 4 days of instruction. And we have many more schools that are, they're still working on this. And we have some schools after the break that will transition to 4 days of instruction. We've been getting a lot of calls and emails asking for when this might happen. So we're just asking for parents to continue to be patient and allow our administrators in our schools to work through the programming. There's a lot of back-end planning, operational planning that goes into effect to allow something like this to happen. So there's been a lot written recently about athletics. And again, I understand from the special meeting that took place last week, the very tough decision that our Board of Education had to make. And so these dates just specify, as it relates to high-risk sports, what decisions were made by the state, ultimately the county, and then local school districts. Just to be clear, we have sports taking place right now. They are not the high-risk sports. So as this slide shows you, what currently is in place, what is coming up next. And this is really important because the board is going to, probably at our next board meeting, have to make another decision about the next round of high-risk sports. So the request I have for this evening, Madam President, that I will need the board to act on one way or another, my recommendation at this point is given the very short season that boys and girls basketball, competitive cheer, and wrestling, to no one's fault, not the board, not our families, and certainly not our athletes. But because of COVID, the season has been dramatically truncated. I'm asking for the board to consider allowing our high-risk sports, those that would currently be taking place now and those that will be taking place if the board so chooses next month, to allow for workouts to take place, to allow for practices to occur, to allow for, at a minimum, our seniors to come together one last time on their respective mat, on their respective field, and practice with their coaches and their teammates. I'm going to come back to this in a second, just because we did have a number of board members who reached out with some questions, and I want to share those questions with the rest of the board and the public. So I know these particular board members are seeking answers that we want to provide tonight. There's a new expectation for school districts across New York State, and what I'm sharing with you here is what we're referring to as pandemic protocols. Now, our legal counsel has shared information around this new responsibility for Newburgh, but really it's a responsibility of every school in the state. The board will have to act on a resolution next month per this new law as it relates to a modification to the school district safety plan. The requirements are in front of you. We have met with union leaders, and we have comments by our faculty and staff that are coming in. We are going to take those that feedback and that input under consideration, and then we're going to, we're obligated to put out a 30-day public comment period leading through March 8th. And then that will allow us at our March 9th board meeting to have a public hearing before the board meeting starts, and then have a resolution ready to go. If we're not able to present a resolution on the 9th, then we will still meet the legal requirements of April 4th by acting on the board meeting on March 23rd. So this is all new, but our team has been working on making the various adjustments and meeting the various timelines established by the state. Please continue to mask up, do your part to protect yourself and to protect others. Madam President, I'll take questions on everything. I'm going to come back in a second to highlight the questions that were asked, and then ask you to please take a vote from the board regarding practices for high-risk sports. Just give me 1 second.
Board members, any questions or comments? Mr. Stradine.
Thank you, Madam President. In regards to the testing that was done at the schools, I am getting some feedback from some of the parents that never provided permission for their children to get tested, but they were tested anyway. Can you provide us with the board with a kind of a protocol, like how the students were requested to have testing? Was it an email to the parents? Was it a letter sent home with the kids that were in the school? And just give us an overall, like how that happened.
So we did a number of things. We had a town hall where I urged families to please consider allowing their children to be tested. I mentioned it at board meetings. We put out robocalls. We met with principals and asked them to also communicate with families so that way we can get the information out to everyone. So that way parents would understand the process. As I went through the process, if you remember, I shared a video so that way our families could see it firsthand. And then we took those students who had their consent forms and provided testing accordingly. To your comment, again, I would ask that if there are any situations where a child was tested without consent from a parent, then that information should absolutely be shared with the principal. And I would ask that it be shared with my team as well, so we can look into it.
Dr. Padilla, I have a question, and my question is about page 9 of your report, the pandemic protocols. What kind of protocols? I mean, this could be anything from testing to reopening schools. what does this mean?
Yeah, so the state is requiring school districts that in the future, should we ever have to be confronted with another pandemic or a virus, a disease of any kind of which has, impacted schools greatly, that we have a set of protocols in place for how we would deal with that. So these pandemic protocols speak to just what you mentioned, how we would go about testing, how we would go about quarantining. It's much of what we're doing now because this is all new learning, with the flexibility that if in the future it's something different, not COVID-19, but something different, that we would move forward and amend our plans accordingly. So right now we drafted some protocols, much of which we are enacting right now. As you know, these protocols and what we're doing right now is not in our district safety plan. So this is an addendum to that would include the various protocols.
Thank you. I see no other hands. Would you like to continue? Well,
Yes.
first, you have to answer those questions, and most of them are mine.
Yep, I'm going to do that right now. So thank you. So I'm just going to read these aloud. So Ms. Mineo forwarded a number of questions that she's seeking answers to, as well as Mr. Levenstein. So I'm going to start with Ms. Mineo's question and then move towards Mr. Levenstein's question, and then I'll ask for additional questions or comments. So the first question was, how many practices per team? And so the district response to that, for current moderate risk sports, the practice has been as follows. So currently track is taking place. They're practicing 3 days a week. They've been impacted greatly with the recent weather. Bowling is doing 5 days a week off campus, and swimming is 3 days a week off campus.
Dr. Padilla, I was asking about your recommendation, those sports.
Okay. So for those sports, right now it'd be 90 minutes long, close to the other moderate risk sports. So perhaps 3 days a week, and then cleaning in between. Your next question was what COVID safe protocols will be in place, and will students' temperature be taken prior to practice? Will they have to fill out the contact form before practice? And so currently that is the practice with the sports that are taking place. And yes, that would be the expectation for these 3 sports. Ms. Mineo asked who will monitor the COVID protocols. Right now, we do have a district health service facilitator that works with school nurses to do that. But in this case, she would work with Trainer Bob and Mr. Harrison, and they would monitor the protocols. As you know, they have to take the screener and they have to do the temperature checks. Anytime something is flagged, they get to see it right away, and they can act right away. Will coaches and assistants, will their pay kind of match the number and duration of these practices in relation to a full season? And so this is where HR would have to get involved, but normally pay is prorated as a result of a shortened season or a period of time. So given that these 3 sports only have until the end of the month, and again, there's a break next week, there's very little time, their pay would match that period of time. Ms. Mineo, before I go on to Mr. Levenstein, is there any other questions you have?
No, thank you.
Okay. Mr. Levenstein had a few questions. So his first one is, what have athletes been doing up till this point? So again, for the sports that have been taking place, they've been practicing. And in some cases, some of them have been competing. For our high-risk sports, they have not been practicing. So we've been waiting. We obviously brought we had the board meeting last week. They're not practicing right now, and depending on the board's decision tonight, we'll determine if they will practice start this week. Did the athletes try out to make the varsity team? The answer to that is no for the 3 sports in question. Did they practice and train as a team? No for the high-risk sports that are in question. Yes to the moderate-risk sports. I believe there may have been one workout with the high-risk sports a few weeks ago, but that was it. Going forward, if approved, what will be the safety protocols? So as I mentioned for Ms. Maneo's question, they will be required to do the daily temperature check and the screener. They will be required per Orange County DOH and Section 9 rules to follow all protocols that have been established in the Return to Play handbook that has been shared with our coaches. And then will the students, parents, coaches, and administration be on board? The answer is yes, although we haven't had a lot of parents. We have had a number of parents reach out for sure. If the board approves for the practices to take place, one of the things we'll do either tonight or tomorrow morning is get the word out to our students and our coaches, and also share something via social media and get information out to our families regarding the ability to practice through this season. However, I want to just add one caveat. Since we're asking the board to consider practicing for high-risk sports for these 3, I would also ask for you to consider, and if you don't want to tonight, I totally respect that, but I would ask you to consider the next round of high-risk sports that would soon begin in the next couple of weeks. They haven't officially started yet, but they will by the end of the month.
I'd like to separate those 2 out.
Okay. So, Madam President, for the current 3 high-risk sports, I'm asking for the board to consider allowing for those sports to practice.
Mr. Stridine, your hand is up.
Thank you, Madam President. So for the practices, would the students who would be in the high-risk sports be required to have their parents sign the waiver that we were shown last week?
Mr. Shaw, can you chime in? I think I know the answer, but I want to just, they're not competing. This would just be practicing with their team. Mr. Shaw?
Darren, let's come back to your question when Mr. Shaw is back. Somebody else had their hand up. Mr. Howard, did you have your hand up?
Yes, I did. So the 3 sports we're referring to are
Basketball, cheer, and wrestling.
okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, Ms. May. How are you?
Hi,
Darren,
Madam President.
You want to repeat your question so Ms. May can respond?
Oh, actually, I heard it.
Great. Then please
Okay, and the
respond.
answer is yes, that the parents would have to sign the waiver. It's an informed consent form. Oops.
Go ahead, Mr. Stridine. I see your hand.
Thank you. So I read the waiver and it's fine on the district's side. I understand that I'm a board member, so if we have to protect the district, but as a parent, I would like to see in that waiver what the district is going to do to protect the kids. So whatever the protocols are, it needs to get spelled out in there so that if the protocols are not followed, then the district, this will force the district to really make sure those protocols are in place. So I would like that to be part of the waiver.
Mr. Levenstein, I see your hand.
Yeah, the waiver is one form that was sent to us. Is the health risk communication also going to be required to be given to parents or given to families before they agree to play the sports?
If I may, and I'm sorry I had to leave the meeting for a minute. Yes, the parents are going to have quite a bit of information. And the construct of this is the governor passed off the issue of liability to the State Department of Health. They pushed it downstream to the county health commissioners. They pushed it off to the school districts, and the school districts, through giving parents all of the information about the risks, have then created an assumption of the risk responsibility for the parents. Now, embedded in the information that the parents will get will be all of the safety protocols required by the state in a January 22nd memo, and also by the county health departments. So they will have all of that information. However, at the end of the day, the risks are there, and they're there by reason of the virus and the fact that there is the potential for transmission, depending upon how close the contacts are going to be.
Mrs. Santiago, you had your hand up before.
Thank you, Madam President. It was actually the same question that Mr. Stridiron had. So thank you regarding the form for the parents.
Thank you. Mr. Levinstein, do you have another question?
No, ma'am.
Mr. Stridiron?
So is it possible to have the two forms together as the waiver? Because the waiver by itself is really a document only to protect the district. But I think that the two documents together, the waiver should reference the other document at least, and say that the district is going to make all attempts, will follow all the protocols, so that the parents know that they're signing, they're assuming the risk, but also the district is also assuming the risk that they have to make sure the protocols are being followed at all times. Because if not, then the waiver is almost like it's null and void.
Dr. Padilla, do you want to comment on that, or Mr. Shaw?
Yeah, I think it's more of a legal, I mean, this is what came from legal and from Orange County. So I'm not, while I understand Mr. Stridiron's point, I'm not as comfortable modifying a document from the county. So I'll refer to Mr. Shaw on this.
Yeah, so the district's responsibilities are very clearly embedded in the state document from January 22nd and the county protocols. Those are our responsibilities, and I believe that they either are or could be referenced in the waiver form. I thought that they actually were.
Mr. Stridiron, are you okay with that?
As long as they're referenced in the actual waiver and the parents sign off that they received a copy of that, I would be fine with it.
We're going to go around and we're going to have a consensus on Dr. Padilla's first request, and that's practices for the three sports, which are cheerleading, wrestling, and basketball. Okay? Yes or no? Mr. Levinstein?
So is just a question, is it boys and girls basketball, correct?
Yes, correct.
Okay, so yes.
Mr. Stridiron?
Well, we're not even allowing, as far as I know, I don't think we're even allowing in-person basketball in our gym classes, right? So I'm not too sure why. I can understand the social aspect of it. As long as the parents have the waiver and they want to make that choice, I'm fine with it. I mean, it's important that the parents have the choice.
Mrs. Maida?
Yes.
Mr. Walker? Yes or no? We can't hear you. You're muted. You're muted.
No.
Thank you. Mrs. Santiago,
Yes.
Mr. Howard,
Yes.
Dr. Henderson,
No.
and I say no. Now let's go to those other teams that you wanted to talk about, and we'll get after you explain the three teams and what we're talking about, the length of time they're going to practice, and who they are.
Madam President, point of order. Can I just ask if that consensus you just took in terms of allowing high-risk sports to practice needs a formal vote by the board? Can I just ask the attorney to weigh in on that?
It does require a formal vote.
So can I ask the attorney to write up that resolution so we can have that prepared as they discuss this next item?
Yes, and then we'll present that at the end of this discussion, okay, as a resolution.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Dr. Badia, kind of explain what we're going to do now.
Okay. I'm just gonna try to share my screen again so that way you can see the sports in question. Okay, so as I've shared, we have sports taking place. They are the low to moderate risk sports. And then we have another round of high risk sports that are scheduled to begin on March 1st. So I'll just make that bigger so you can see it. So this is what's considered fall 2. And these sports are considered high risk: football, volleyball, and competitive cheer. So as you can see from the dates, from March 1st through April 19th, the next round of high risk sports are what you have in front of you. And the request this evening is to allow them to begin practicing. I'm not asking if you are willing to allow for the high risk sports this evening to take place altogether. This is merely, will you allow them to practice? I do imagine at our next board meeting, we would be asking you to vote on allowing for those sports to take place.
Thank you. We're going to try a consensus on those three sports to practice only. So I'm going to start with Mr. Levenstein.
Practice only with the same documentation and waivers. I'm good.
Mr. Stridiron.
Would it be possible to get some kind of plan? Because it's football, we have a lot of students. Is there a plan in place on how they would be able to separate, keep the students with social distancing? Or is there going to be possibility of not even having social distancing on football? If it's just practice, you probably could do some. Is there a plan, a written plan by the coach or anyone in the athletic department on how they would even be able to run that?
So much of that is spelled out. Well, I wouldn't say spelled out, but just I want to, maybe this is obvious to note, but I don't want to make any assumptions that the New York State Athletics, New York State Department of Health, and the local departments of health have given the green light for high-risk sports to take place. To your question, in the return to play, there are various protocols established for high-risk sports.
And what I understood was that they could have like scrimmages or stuff like that during their practices.
Yeah,
So-
and usually what they do, so for football specifically, because it is a much bigger group of students, is that they cohort the students. So that way, for instance, a group of 5 will do various drills together rather than a group of 50. And that's what's pretty common across other states as well, is that they cohort students in order to run drills and practice.
Mr. Stridarn, what's your vote? What's your consensus vote?
I mean, I understand that there's a plan. It's kind of thrown on us at this point. I don't really understand how it could happen this way, but I guess this is what we have to deal with. I mean, as long as the parents are aware of it, I just concerned that after, now these practices are all going to take place after the normal school day, right? This is not going to be taking place before school. And then the kids go back in, into the school. Like, are they going to be?
Going to go back sometime.
No, as far as like if it's a practice in the morning and then they go into like a night school.
No. They have classes during the day.
Okay. And I mean, I'm for it. I mean, at some point we got to take risks. And the parents are going to be signing the waivers. I'm not 100% comfortable with it, but I think it's at this point we have to move forward.
Mrs. Maida.
Is football definitely going to be outside? I mean, they have to be outside, right?
Yes, they have to be.
Okay, so yes.
Mr. Walker.
The virus is mutating. I don't know how many people will be vaccinated by the time that would make me feel comfortable, so I'll say no.
Mr. Howard.
Madam President, so before I vote, I would just like to say, so Mr. Stridarn asked some very good questions. So with this being brought before the board for our consensus and for our voting, I would think that we should have had a little bit more information in regards to, so what is a practice going to look like? And I understand it's time for us to move on, and I agree. But I still wish we had a little bit more information, but based on what I've heard and what you've explained, I can say yes, it's an outdoor sport. It's going to be outdoors, and we're breaking it down from instead of 50 doing it in groups of 5. I would have liked a little more information in regards to how that PPE was going to be done and how the social distance was going to take place. But I will vote yes.
Mrs. Santiago.
Thank you. I agree with everybody so far, and I would recommend that before you come to us with requesting any other votes, please make sure that you share as much information, such as the questions that are being asked today. If you could bring that to us before we vote, greatly appreciate it. Thank you. So I say yes.
You say yes. Dr. Henderson.
My vote is for no. When you look at the virus and how it's impacted communities, specifically very culturally diverse communities, it has not been well. So I would vote for no to protect our community. Thank you.
I too vote no. Mr. McCoy, what's the tally?
They both had 5 in the affirmative, but you just now have to vote with the formal resolutions.
Okay. So, Dr. Padilla, you want to do the resolution, please?
Mr. Shaw, what do you have written up?
Okay, I sent that to the board clerk, if he could read it.
Shall the district allow practices in the following high-risk winter sports: competitive cheerleading, wrestling, and basketball?
I'd like to entertain a motion.
So moved.
Second.
We've had discussion, so we're just going to go right to the vote. Mr. McCoy?
Mr. Howard?
Okay, before I vote, I need to ask one more question, Madam President. So with the testing, if a positive testing comes up, does that stop the practices?
So we would still be bound by quarantine and isolation protocols. So if someone tests positive, then yeah, whoever they were in contact with would have to be quarantined. But again, given the time frame, it's likely they won't be able to practice for the rest of the time.
Okay, yes.
Mr. Levinstein,
Yes.
Miss Maida,
Yeah, yes,
Miss Mineo,
No.
Miss Santiago,
Yes.
Mr. Stridiron.
I have a question as well. Will the students that are participating in the high-risk sports be tested before they do the practices?
So in our meeting last week, we talked about testing as a possibility for competition. So if they were competing against students from other districts, one idea would be that they would. But here, the board voted down any competitions. So this is just practice, so no.
So it's not, can the board require testing of students to participate in practices for high-risk sports?
Mr. Shaw?
Yes, the board could require that.
Madam President, would it be possible to modify the votes on these two items if the board wants it to require testing of students prior to practicing? I don't know how long it takes to get the results back, but
So if you want to if you want to amend, that I need a second to amend it. Okay.
Second.
Okay. Thank you. So now let's start over again, Mr. McCoy. We have an amended
Point of order.
resolution. Yes.
Point of order. I need some help from the lawyers. I know what you guys are trying to do, but I just need some clarification here.
Okay. There's the issue of when the testing would be done and then how frequently. Would it be before the first practice? Would it be at any other time?
I would like to at least have it weekly.
Okay, so we could go with be it further resolved that the athletes who are practicing shall be tested with the COVID-19 rapid test on at least a weekly basis.
Madam President,
Yes, sir.
can I move for an amendment on that?
Another amendment. Let's hear what you say.
Okay, so I would say that before they start, all students need to be tested, then on a weekly basis.
You need a second for that.
I'll
Okay.
second that. That's what I thought we were doing. Before they even make their first practice, they should be tested.
Yes.
All.
All the students that participate in the high-risk sports. That's
Yeah.
what, yes.
Now, before we do anything else, Mr. Levinstein, ask your question.
So we're going to have hundreds of athletes, right? I mean, the football team is quite large. So I don't know if is it a practical matter? I mean, I'm certainly okay with prior to practice to have it done, but on a weekly basis, when this season is going to be 2.5 weeks, that's first coming up. I don't see that as that beneficial.
It gives us information, Mark. That's what I was looking for.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. Mr. Walker.
If it were to become available, could the district require that all members of sports teams be vaccinated? Did you hear me?
Yeah. Where are you, Mr. Shaw? Mrs. May, you're muted.
Sorry. Oh, yeah, what was the question, please?
If it became if it becomes available, can you hear me?
Mhm.
Yes.
Okay. If it becomes available, could the district require that all athletes, or particularly the ones in high risk, be vaccinated?
I don't think we can require them to be vaccinated at this time. We can strongly encourage it. However, I don't think that there are sufficient vaccinations available for students to be vaccinated. And many of the students are not of an age where it would be available to them.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so we have an amendment. Mr. McCoy, can you read that whole thing and then we'll vote to amend?
This is the amendment. Be it further resolved that all high-risk winter sport athletes be COVID-19 rapid tested prior to participation in practices and weekly COVID rapid testing.
Okay. So let's have a vote on the amendment to amend.
Mr. Levinstein,
Yes.
Ms. Maida,
Yes.
Ms. Mineo,
Yes, to amend.
Ms. Santiago,
Yes.
Mr. Stridiron,
Yes.
Mr. Walker,
Yes.
Dr. Henderson,
Yes, to amend.
Mr. Howard.
Yes.
We have an amended resolution on the floor. I'd like to, can I have a roll call?
Mr. Howard,
Yes.
Mr. Levinstein,
Yes.
Ms. Maida,
Yes.
Ms. Mineo,
No.
Ms. Santiago,
Yes.
Mr. Stridiron,
Yes.
Mr. Walker,
No.
Dr. Henderson.
No.
Ms. Santiago, you said no, correct?
No, I said yes.
Yes.
All right, so that passes by 5. 5 in affirmative.
Okay, we're going to move on to the next resolution. And that is for the next group of high-risk sports to practice. Would you like to read that resolution again, Mr. McCoy? As amended, I think.
Yeah. Shall the district allow practices in the following high-risk fall sports, competitive cheerleading, football, and volleyball, and be it further resolved that all high-risk fall athletes shall be COVID-19 rapid tested prior to participation and COVID-19 rapid tested weekly.
Thank you, Mr. McCoy. I'd like to entertain a motion, please.
So moved.
Second.
Do we need any discussion? Let's see if there are any hands. Roll call up. Dr. Henderson.
Thank you, Madam President. Yeah, I just wanted to discuss a few things, especially regarding the testing and typical testing procedures that would take place with a rapid test versus the PCR test. How are those tests going to be performed? Typically, the rapid test is self-performed, so there is some variability issues because the individual is deciding how far they want to stick that swab up their nose compared to the PCR, which is usually done by a medical health professional. And I guess my other question would be, how are these tests being funded? Because they're not cheap. And if we're offering these to our student athletes, I think we should certainly consider offering them to other clubs, groups, organizations that should also have the right to compete and participate in their specific hobby or activity. Thank you.
Dr. Padilla, do you have an answer for that?
Yes. Mr. Forget, can you provide the board with an update on rapid tests?
Sure. So we have the protocol in place for the administration of the testing. We are using the Abbott test. So all of our nurses have been through the training to administer those tests. one conversation that we did have was that in the event an individual were to test positive, we would highly recommend that the families take their child to get the PCR test as a follow-up. But we would use that particular determination to inform the state as to positive or negative. So we do have the protocols in place. We do have some tests that are remaining from when we had to do the 20% testing. And I did receive authorization from the New York State Department of Health to use them at our need. This would obviously fit the need. I don't believe that we would have enough to cover everything. We would have to order more, and we will begin to look into that. Again, this is new for us as well, but we'll make it happen if that's what the board wishes.
Dr. Henderson.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Mr. Forger, for that explanation. I just want to make sure that the district is aware that the rapid test is much less accurate compared to the PCR test. Just everybody is well aware of that, correct?
No, it wasn't.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Henderson. I think we're up to a roll call, Mr. McCoy.
Ms. Maida,
Yes.
Ms. Mineo,
No.
Ms. Santiago,
Yes.
Mr. Stridiron.
Dr. Henderson actually brought up an interesting point. I wish I thought we actually had a lot of tests remaining, but we should actually get some kind of an idea sent to the board as what the cost is going to be after we run out of these other tests and how it's going to be paid for. Because I would like to see more testing done for other extracurricular activities and for staff if they want to get tested. So as far as this, I'm going to vote yes.
Thank you. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker?
Is this mutating? No.
Thank you. Dr. Henderson?
My vote is no.
Mr. Howard?
I agree with Mr. Stridiron. We do. It will give us more information if we do that, and I think that's important. So I'm going to vote yes.
Mr. Levinstein?
Yes.
That received 5 in the affirmative.
Thank you. Dr. Padilla, let's move on.
Okay. Item 2.2 is something new that we're doing called the district fiscal profile. As you guys know, we are in the midst of the budget cycle, and my team has been working very hard to get us to the point where we are today and after. So as you know, tonight will be an opportunity to share with the board and the community a fiscal profile of the district. And then on the 23rd, our plan.
Dr. Padilla, you froze.
Looking much larger than just our district. Looking at a peer both Orange County and small city schools. And so if you have questions, we ask that at the end of that section to please ask your questions. And then right after that, we'll get right into the school. If you want to go ahead and present your screen.
Will do. Can everybody see my screen? Just a thumbs up. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Dr. P, I don't know if you realized, but you froze while you were giving your introduction. So I just want to let the Board of Education know that we will be sharing historical budget analysis providing context through comparative data against both small city school districts and the region, and also the state. Furthermore, the second part of the presentation, we will dig into the fiscal school year 2021 and then prepare for the fiscal school year 21-22. So the first slide here is a comparison to small city similar school district peers. The arrow indicated here is showing us the Newburgh and Large City School District. Its enrollment, its income percent of enrollment, so we have a low income percentage of 65%, and our CWR. And the CWR is our realized wealth index on statewide averages. And that's two factors, property wealth per pupil and income wealth per pupil. And what this gives us is a comparison, but it also allows us to see how we are faring against other districts that are similar, and as well as maybe we can learn from districts who may be in better positions, whether it's academically or fiscally, and how can we use that to model our school district as well. We also thought it was equally important to share data on our region, right? So what are the schools right in our backyard? What are the schools and outside of our community, and how do we fare against them? And you can see in this data that we are very similar to the Middletown City School District. However, there is much variance in the other school districts around us, especially in perspective to income and combined wealth ratio. Education in New York is funded from a combination, our local, which is our taxpayers, right? State, which is our state aid, and federal resources. This is a pie chart of the Newburgh and Large City School District and how we're funded. And it indicates that 56%, more than half of our budget, is funded by state aid. A much smaller sliver of about 26% is our federal sources, and our local sources is about 43% comes from our tax revenue. So how is our district revenue state aid broken down? This was from the governor's proposal back in April. We know that through our analysis that this number is a little small, it is much smaller in 2021 than we anticipated. But from this data pulled in April 2020, our orange represents our building aid, red represents our foundation aid. That's our largest portion of aid that we receive from the state. The teal represents our transportation, and the gray represents others. And you can see here that our foundation aid has slightly went up in 2020, remained flat in 2021, and we anticipate it to be flat again for 2022. We have approximately the same amount for transportation and all others. And obviously we don't have a blue for BOCES aid because we're a non-component school district. Operating expenses in a school are categorized in different ways. And you can see here that we're going to talk about function codes and object codes. So when we present budget codes to you next week, you'll see that they're 4 numbers, 3 numbers, and then 2 numbers. And the 4 numbers are the function code. And we have to, schools have to use accounting protocols so that we are reporting to the state exactly how we're spending our funding. And this shows us clearly that 58% of our budget is spent on instruction. The red represents general support. The green represents our transportation, and the orange represents employee benefits. So showing us that nearly 80% of our budget is spent on instruction and benefits. We then start to narrow down our budget codes and categorize them by objects. And that's the number that the 3 numbers that you see in the second set of a budget code. And you can see here, personnel services refers to salaries. So whenever you see that, you know that it's salaries. Green is our equipment line. Blue is contractual. And in this pie chart, the teal represents employee benefits. So what is really the fiscal story of Newburgh over this time between 2014 and 19? And what I like about this chart is it talks about decisions, board goals, and you can see embedded in how spending happened in Newburgh based on superintendent's goals, board goals. And what I want to highlight here is that there was an increase in spending in psychological services and social work services, which definitely correlates with the SEL work that was dedicated for the district. You'll also see increased spending in computer-assisted instruction, as well as our central data processing. And within our central data processing, that's our microtechs, our support staff, and our infrastructure. So those two, they were goals for the district, and we could see that they were there. I do want to point out, as all data and graphs could be skewed, that this dollar amount is a better place to look at, because it's unclassified funds here, although it looks very large, the number in the overall budget was only $2,000. And unclassified just means that it doesn't fall in any of the categories that it would be aidable. So how is the district spending average versus the state averages? And this pie chart really shows us that we are very similar to the state in some areas. So in the blue represents instruction, and the state on average spends about 53% of their budget on instruction, and Newburgh 55%. The state on average, school districts spend about 22% on employee benefits, and the Newburgh and Large City School District spends 27%. You can also see that general support is 10% at the state, and general support in Newburgh is at 7.545%. What you do not see here is you don't see a yellow in this pie chart here in the Newburgh and Large City School District, and that's our debt service. Clearly, we know that we have a yearly payment to our principal and interest and debt service, but how we categorize it in our accounting is that we do a fund transfer, an interfund transfer that's represented in purple, and that's why it looks a little bit larger and that the yellow isn't represented there. How do we compare our general funds and our object codes? And again, the charts look very similar, and that's really where you want your district to be. You want it to fare on the averages of other schools across New York State, where our personnel services or our salaries, we're dead 47% for us and 47% across New York. Our benefits here are outlined again for the 22% in comparison to 27% in Newburgh. So this is, and then the red represents our contracts and supplies. And New York State is almost 21%, and we are almost 20%. This slide indicates what we projected to be our revenue when building the budget. And you want these two bar graphs to be as aligned as possible. You want the budget, you always want a budget a little under your revenue and come in above it. In the event that a school district tends to budget above their revenue and then their actual comes in less, it will lead you to a deficit. And you could see here that each time we under budgeted the revenue by just a couple percent each time. But again, that's where a district should be in order to avoid a deficit. Now, the other part of the budget, you have your revenue, your money that's coming in, and then obviously your expenses is the other side. And here you want to overestimate your budget to your actual, so that you have you would have a surplus going in there, because again, if you don't, it would lead to possible barriers and deficits in your budget and your spending. So you want to underestimate your revenue and overestimate your expenses by about 2% for the two, so that they will come out as a net. This slide indicates our teacher enrollment and our student enrollment. So I'm sorry, our student enrollment and our FTE. This is a very telling story of Newburgh here. You can see in 2014 and 15, there was a big gap between the amount of FTE and the difference in enrollment. In 2016, you could see that there was, following all the way to 2018, there was an uptick in hiring of teachers and increasing the FTE. Although there was a declining enrollment, there was an increase in FTE. You really want these charts to start to follow the same pattern of each other and to get close together. So you can see that the district has made some really solid decisions, and we're keeping up with our FTE, and we're modeling our enrollment with our FTE. So our operating expenditures, how much do we spend per student, and what has that trend been for over the past 5 years? So clearly we can see here that we have an uptick in our trend and that each year we spend an increase in per pupil for each student's expenses. But how does that compare? Like, what does that mean in context to other city school districts? So you could see here that was the same group of city school districts at the beginning of our presentation and where Newburgh fares and how much they spend per pupil. And we are at the upper end of this chart. And we spend a little bit more than the average. The average is $20,977 among the school districts, city school districts, and we are at $22,000. How do we fare across our region? And you can see here, again, our average is $22,000 and we are slightly above it. The average across the region is $22,396 and we're slightly above it at $22,512. And then there's some comparative data to Orange County school districts. So this is our fund balance revenue and how much, what percentage we have in comparison to our small city school districts. And we are slightly above the average at 20%, and the average is 16.6%, which is telling us that we have a healthy reserve and we're slightly above the average in comparison to city school districts. When we compare it to our local, we are slightly below the average in the fund balance. Some soft data that will help us to understand this is that in comparison to our regional schools, we did not raise taxes. So in raising taxes, you usually end up with, you could end up with more of a surplus, allowing you to build your fund balances. This chart is how do we compare against city school districts of how many students per teacher FTE. So how many teachers do we have compared to our enrollment? And in Newburgh, you actually want to be to the right of this slide. So we are actually doing much better at 12 students per teacher, where the other school districts are in a range of 13 to 18 students per teacher. Okay, so you can see here, Yonkers has 18 students per teacher, and in Newburgh we have 12. Across the region, we are still faring very well in the ratio of student to teacher at 12. And you can see here, more affluent school districts are performing at 15 and 13 students per teacher, and Newburgh, Middletown, and Valley Center are at 12. Our instructional expenses, how do we fare across small city school districts? We are slightly above the average, and what we are spending in our function codes are 2000s on instruction. And we are we're just a hair over the average at 55% in the region on our spending for instruction. Personnel expenses, this is our salaries, and in Newburgh, we spend 74.85% in our 0.1 and 0.8 salary and employee benefits in comparison to small city school districts. So when I took you back to the pie chart where we saw our expenses and our personnel, this is how we're faring across the city school districts. How do we compare in the region? We are slightly above average in the region as well. For our expenses and salaries and benefits. I know that was a lot of data and a lot of information for you to digest. I think it's important for us to just see where we're faring and how the board has been making some very conscientious fiscal decisions, and that I really would like to celebrate that we're in a very good place in regards to averages against the region, small city schools, peer group, as well as the state. I just, before I go to the next section, Madam President, I'd like to know if there's any questions.
I don't see any hands, so why don't you continue?
Okay, thank you very much. So now we're going to go into the finite details of our current school budget. I want to review some high-level assumptions. So the governor did give his proposal just recently, and with that, there is going to be a stimulus package, a COVID relief stimulus package that will result in an increase of revenue for our fiscal school year 2022. We had a declining enrollment, and there will be a slightly decline enrollment for next year. We wonder, obviously COVID related, with maybe more students being homeschooled, and parents keeping back pre-K and kindergarten students and waiting. Our transportation aid is still an unknown, whether our standby costs will be honored, right? So right now, we don't know what that's going to look like. So that's still an unknown that we have to consider when we're planning next year's school budget. And one-time revenues from prior school year. So what were some of those one-time revenues, such as the sale of Washington Street and appropriated fund balance, and how are we going to adapt the new budget to those one-time revenues? Our expenses are increasing. Overall, our benefits are increasing by 6%. We just received notification that TRS, which is our teacher retirement system, is increasing from 9.53% to 9.8%. And our ERS right now, we're estimating between 16.5 and 17%. Our medical benefits, we received our rates just this past January, have increased up to nearly 8%. And our workman's compensation insurance will increase by approximately 14%. So those are obligations that we have to meet in next year's budget. So tax cap 21-22 versus our obligations. Our property tax levy growth factor is below 2%. It's at 1.28%. This the tax cap is computed using a very complicated multi-step formula, and we have a calculator that helps us to run that formula from the comptroller's website. We have many costs outside of our control that exceed that 1.8% that I reviewed with you just earlier. So our health benefits, our TRS rates, our contractual obligations, and our utilities are all increasing at rates that are much higher than the levy growth factors allows. I'm going to try to unpack as simple as I can the complicated tax cap formula and show you what that looks like for Newburgh. This column here shows us our 2021 budget at 0% tax levy. We had an opportunity to raise the levy last year up to 5% for a total of $5.5 million. We did not, and we remained levied at $110 million and 110.864. In 2022, you have to take the prior year's levy, and then right here, we have a decrease in our tax-based growth factor. So what I'm highlighting is red is what's going to decrease the amount that we can levy this year that we can ask the community for. Our pilots are slightly increasing, but in general remaining flat. Our capital levy from the prior year, our capital levy exclusions. And then I want to take you here to another decrease of our capital levy exclusions. The capital levy exclusion is you take your debt services minus your building aid. Next year's debt services, we're going to see a decline because we are borrowing less as we're keeping up with the borrowing of our bonds with the capital projects. So we anticipated to have borrowed more money this coming March, and we do not have to borrow that at that time because we're going to deplete our capital fund reserve first, allowing us to have a smaller debt service payment next year. But this gives us a smaller exclusion, which then leads us to a smaller levy that we're able to actually increase. And the maximum levy right now is 1.77% or $1.9 million. I do want to let the board know that this number here, I keep a watchful eye on it because I also took out the anticipated early state aid that we should receive from the completion of the pool project. So the pool is anticipated to be completed this fiscal school year, which means we will be able to see that early aid next year. And I had to take that exclusion out. Another reason why it's much lower this year. I wanted to show the board what a 1% levy for the tax cap would look like. That would mean that we would be able to levy $1.1 million, allowing us to levy a total of $111,973,000. What you will notice as I did some further projections with information that I have, understanding that some variables might change, is that if you increase by 1% each year, of approximately $1 million, then you're able to increase your revenue for your local tax, your local levy over 5 years, about $5 million. In the event that you do not levy anything, you would actually be leaving about $10 million in local revenue on the table. Our reserves, they are moving in a very positive direction, although I wanted to unpack and explain something. Reserves can sometimes be complicated as well, because right away we see this as a number. People think it's the rainy day amount that you're supposed to use in the event that something happens. And clearly that is what it's for. But reserves have restrictions, and different reserves require different guidelines. So for example, and this column here, it's our current reserves as of 6/30. This was our expenses within those categories for 1920. This column explains the required reserve. So we're required to keep reserves amount based on liability. And then so truly, what's really available to us to be able to utilize in our school budget. So I'll just take you across here. The workman's comp, we have a healthy reserve of approximately 8.3 million. Last year, our expenses were 1.1 million. However, our actuary report, or our liability, which means which workman comp claims are in the hopper and what we are liable for, is over $6 million. So we would not be able to utilize that reserve money. So our true reserve on that is 2 million. Okay. And so if you do a comparison, our reserves here, we have $41 million in comparison to the true 10 million that we can actually utilize. One other factor on this slide that I want to bring you towards is our unassigned authorized 4% fund balance, which we have 11.4 million in. This is utilized really for our cash flow. So when we talk about revenues coming in, such as our taxes, our state aid, that doesn't come to the district in one lump sum. And we have to pay our payroll every other week, which is approximately $6 million, as well as bills coming into the district. And we required to have cash flow into the bank to be able to meet those demands while waiting for other cashes to come into the the district monthly. This slide is a revenue analysis. So in our 2021, we have indicated which revenues we utilized in order to create the budget. And this is just a scenario for the board to review if we had a 1% tax levy and utilized 98% of our state aid appropriated funds. It's not recommended to utilize 100% of your state aid because the number is determined by what you enter in August, and over a full school year, those numbers can change and spending can change, and you're most likely not going to get that first state aid run amount. What's highlighted in here, green here, is based on that analysis of our fund balance, things that we can possibly move in and out in order to create our superintendent's proposed budget for next meeting. And our last slide just highlights the scenario in which we can utilize an appropriated fund balance as well as some of our reserves, what our target revenue and our budget would be, and what deficit or what gap we would need to close with these different scenarios. That concludes the analysis this evening, and I'm available for any questions.
Thank you for your comprehensive report. A lot to hear right now. Mr. Stradarian, you have a question.
Thank you, Madam President. So over the last year, what has been the biggest savings or non-expense that we budgeted for besides transportation? Are there areas in the budget that we just have not spent the money and it is probably going to be put into fund balance?
Thank you, Mr. Stradarian, for your question. Absolutely, transportation is one of them, would be one of the highest one. Additionally, we have not had to use as much overtime for our staff, particularly for security, clerical. CSEA hasn't had to use as much overtime. So those extra earnings are also a savings for us right now. We have spent some money on substitutes, so over $1 million on teaching substitutes already this year, but it's a little bit lower than where we were last year at this time. So we would probably actualize some savings in there as well.
Mr. Levinstein?
Thank you, Madam President. So Dr. Spindler, I think this is a lot of data here, really good. I think it's important that we look at our district in comparison to other small city schools and to Orange County schools to make some judgments on our district, both financially and educationally. And I thank you very much for all this work.
Mr. Stronarn, I see your hand again.
Thank you, Madam President. So I see that the assumption is just of 1% tax levy. I just know that the situation with the community at this time to make any kind of tax increase is, yes, we're going to be leaving money on the table. I know and understand that, but it's the community's money. So I would try and as much as possible to use the fund balance in a time, definitely in times like this, rather than to tax the people in the community that may be either unemployed or going through difficulty paying the taxes they already have. So that's my thing. You know, as far as voting on an upcoming budget, I personally do not want to see a tax levy increase. Thank you.
Any other questions, board members? Thank you, Dr. Spindler. Dr. Padilla?
Yep, thank you. So Dr. Spindler, thank you. And Madam President, I just want to make one quick comment to our buildings and ground staff. Just want to acknowledge and thank them for preparing our buildings safely in order to return everyone tomorrow. As you know, there's been a lot of snow, so they've been working very, very hard over the last week and a half with a lot of cleanup. So just thought it was important to acknowledge them. Madam President, that concludes my items for this evening.
Thank you. We're going to move on to public comments on agenda items. Mr. McCoy, and while you're talking, Mr. McCoy, can you review the process that we have for public comments?
Thank you, Madam President. Yeah, public comments need to be submitted to publiccomment@necsd.net by 5 p.m. on the day of the board meeting. And we did not receive any public comment on agenda items for this evening's board meeting.
Thank you. We're going to move on to board committees. We're going to start with curriculum and instruction. Mrs. Maida.
In the interest of time, I just wanted to highlight two very important things that we discussed. Our director of ELA, Ms. Nielsen, provided extensive information about our ELA curriculum. We usually talk about readings, and this time we talked about everything but reading. We talked about our English curriculum across the district for our students, so that was very helpful. Also, Mr. Bayer and Ms. Moriarty gave an update on, excuse me, on mitigating regression, which is a very big topic during the pandemic, and their ideas and their I'm sorry, their ideas and plans for intensive practice and intervention for our students in need was very informative, and we'll have more discussion on that as time goes on. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to move on to Audit and Finance Committee. Mrs. Santiago.
Thank you, Madam President. Most of the items that we discussed, we had our meeting just before this meeting at 5 o'clock, and the majority of the items we'll be voting on. Some of the other things that we touched on was we had an internal audit status report. Dr. Spindler took us through what to be expecting in the coming months from our internal auditor. from Naraki Smith. She also touched a little bit on the presentation that she just made earlier. Want to thank her. She's very excited about the new tool that she's using, and it looks to be sharing a lot of information. And we also talked about upcoming budget priorities that the different committees are being asked to share their needs. And we had a little discussion about budgetary transfers that that we've asked the policy committee to consider. So that's all for today. Thank you.
Thank you. We are now going to take a Maneo minute. I'm giving everybody 2 minutes to get up, get something to eat, get a drink, use the restroom, whatever. 2 minutes.
Thank you.
9:02.
You have 5 back, Madam President. I'm starting the recording back up.
Repeat that, please, Mr. McCoy.
There's 5 members in the room. The recording has started, ma'am.
Thank you. We're going to move on to our Assistant Superintendent for Curriculum and Instruction, Elementary, Mrs. Moriarty.
Thank you, Madam President. Elementary curriculum instruction presents items 5.1 through 5.3 as consent agenda items for your consideration this evening.
Would any member like to separate out any of these items? I'd like to entertain a motion, please.
So moved.
Second.
Questions or discussion? Roll call, Mr. Clerk.
Ms. Beneo,
Yes.
Ms. Santiago,
Yes.
Mr. Stridiron,
Yes.
Mr. Walker,
Yes.
Dr. Henderson,
Yes.
Mr. Howard,
Yes.
Mr. Levinstein,
Yes.
Ms. Maida.
Yes.
Thank you, Madam President. That concludes my items.
Thank you, Mrs. Moriarty. We're going to move on to our Assistant Superintendent for Curriculum Secondary, Mr. Bayer.
Thank you, Madam President. Curriculum Instruction Secondary has 2 items on the consent agenda for the board's consideration this evening.
Would any member like to separate out any of these items? I'd like to entertain a motion, please.
So moved.
Second.
Questions or discussion? Roll call, Mr. Clerk.
Ms. Santiago,
Yes.
Mr. Stridiron,
Yes.
Mr. Walker,
Yes.
Dr. Henderson,
Yes.
Mr. Howard,
Yes.
Mr. Levinstein,
Yes.
Ms. Maida,
Yes.
Ms. Beneo.
Yes.
Thank you. That concludes my items.
Thank you, Mr. Bayer. We're going to move on to our Assistant Superintendent for Student Support Services, Dr. Roman.
Thank you, Madam President. Under the Student Support Services agenda, I present to you one item, recommendations from CSE CPSE for the board's consideration.
I'd like to entertain a motion, please.
So moved.
Second.
Questions or discussion? Roll call, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Stridiron,
Yes.
Mr. Walker,
Yes.
Dr. Henderson,
Yes.
Mr. Howard,
Yes.
Mr. Levinstein,
Yes.
Ms. Maida,
Yes.
Ms. Beneo,
Yes.
Ms. Santiago.
Yes.
Thank you. That concludes my items.
Thank you, Dr. Roman. We're going to move on to our Assistant Superintendent of Finance, Dr. Spindler.
Thank you, Madam President. Finance presents to you items 8.1 through 8.7 as a consent agenda for your consideration.
Would any member like to separate out any of these items? I'd like to entertain a motion, please.
So moved.
Second.
Questions or discussion? Roll call, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Walker,
Yes.
Dr. Henderson,
Yes.
Mr. Howard,
Yes.
Mr. Levinstein,
Yes.
Ms. Maida,
Yes.
Ms. Beneo,
Yes.
Ms. Santiago,
Yes.
Mr. Stridiron.
Yes.
That concludes my items for this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Spindler. We're going to move on to our Assistant Superintendent for Human Resources, Mr. McLemore.
Thank you, Madam President. On the Human Resources agenda, I have items 9.1 through 9.6 for your consideration on tonight.
Would any member like to separate out any of these items? I'd like to entertain a motion, please.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Questions or discussion? Mr. Stridiron.
Thank you, Madam President. I do have a question on number 2. I was able to see the video of the presentation by Dr. Holly, and I would assume this person is going to be working with Dr. Holly over the next period of time. Do we have a contract with Dr. Holly? Because I don't recall it ever coming up. And because I know during the presentation, Dr. Padilla said he was going to be working with him over the next few years. Is there a contract with Dr. Holly? And if so, could you provide that information for us?
So we have a $10,000 contract that's permissible under board policy. In terms of future contracts, those would have to come to the board.
I'm gonna raise my hand.
Mr. Stradar?
Thank you. So there's actually a written contract. Can that be provided to the board? Like, how long does that run for? And what does it include?
Yeah, we can make that available to the board. We'll provide it this Friday. It's through the end of the year.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comment? Okay, roll call, Mr. Clerk.
Dr. Henderson?
Come on. Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Howard?
Yes.
Mr. Levinstein?
Yes.
Ms. Maida?
Yes.
Ms. Mineo?
Yes.
Ms. Santiago? Ms. Santiago?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Stradar?
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Thank you.
That concludes my items, Madam President. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McLemore. We're going to move on to the clerk of the board, Mr. McCoy.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the approval of the minutes on 10.1 of January 26, 2021.
Would any member like to separate out any of these items?
It's not on consent, so you're only considering one item now.
Oh, sorry. I'd like to entertain a motion then.
So moved.
Second.
Questions or discussion? Roll call, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Howard?
Yes. I'm
Mr.
sorry.
Levinstein?
Yes.
Ms. Maida?
Yes.
Ms. Mineo?
Yes.
Ms. Santiago?
Yes.
Mr. Stradar?
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Dr. Henderson?
Yes.
And they also have the minutes from the special meeting on February 4th. ma'am.
Okay, I'd like to entertain a motion, please.
So
Second.
Questions or discussion? Roll call, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Levinstein?
Yes.
Ms. Maida?
Yes.
Ms. Mineo?
Yes.
Ms. Santiago?
Yes.
Mr. Stradar?
Abstain.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Dr. Henderson?
Yes.
Mr. Howard?
yeah.
That is a yes. That concludes my items, Madam President.
Thank you. I think everybody is a little on delay now. This is really kind of a long meeting. We're going to go to public comments on non-agenda items, Mr. McCoy. And I would like you to review the procedures again because we did get something, but it didn't follow the procedures. So go ahead.
Thank you, Madam President. If you would like the comments, if you'd like your comments read in public in front of the board, you must email your comments on agenda or non-agenda items to publiccomment@edcsd.net by 5 p.m. on the day of the meeting. There was no non-agenda public comment submitted on time, ma'am.
Now, Mr. McCoy, you said 5 p.m. It's not 5
Excuse
p.m.
me, it's 1 p.m. on the day of the board meeting.
Thank you. And it goes to that specific email address, not to individual board, not to board members. So here it is. I'd like to entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Roll call, Mr. Clerk.
Ms. Maida,
Yes.
Ms. Mineo,
Yes, we hear your children calling you.
Ms. Santiago,
Yes.
Mr. Stradar,
Yes, I know how
Aw.
that feels.
Ms. Walker, Mr. Walker,
Yes.
Dr. Henderson,
Yes, you better go take care of that.
and Mr.
Yes.
Howard,
Yes.
and Mr. Levinstein.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone,
Good night,
and good
all.
night.